Women and the Constitution. 18th century was characterized by a relatively low activity of women in politics. In fact, women were not present at the gathering that wrote the Declaration of Independence. Women were not represented on that committee at all. Women were also not represented at the 1787 meeting in Philadelphia, which wrote the Constitution of the United States. So women were essentially politically inactive during the 18th century. When independence was declared, Abigail Adams and John Adams exchanged a series of letters. John Adams was part of the committee which produced the Declaration of Independence, whose main writer was Thomas Jefferson. And Abigail Adams wrote him a letter stating, "I wish you would ever write me a letter half as long as I write you." So she starts out by trying to shame him that he doesn't write her often enough. And then she goes on to say, "I hear that you have declared an independency. And by the way, in the new code of laws, which I suppose it will be necessary for you to make, I desire you would remember the ladies, and be more generous and favorable to them than your ancestors. Do not put such unlimited power into the hands of the husbands. Remember, all men would be tyrants if they could." Here we go. The male bashing begins, you see. "If particular care and attention is not paid to the ladies, we are determined to foment a rebellion, and will not hold ourselves bound by any laws in which we have no voice or representation. That your sex is naturally tyrannical is a truth so thoroughly established as to admit of no dispute, but such of you as wish to be happy willingly give up the harsh title of master for the more tender and endearing one of friend." So it's pretty interesting language, and John Adams wrote back, dismissing her letter. "As to your extraordinary code of laws, I cannot but laugh." And then he goes on to say that, you are very saucy, and I won't blot it out. I won't forget it. Depend on it, we know better than to repeal our masculine systems. Although they are in full force, they are little more than theory. We dare not exert our power in full latitude. We are obliged to go fairly and softly, and in practice, we are the subjects. It's very interesting because what he's alluding to in defending his and other men's privileged political status is that women really are privileged in the private sphere. If men are dominating the public sphere, then women behind the scenes are dominating the private life. Quite interesting. Now, politically speaking, from the point of view of public life, let's talk about several social movements that have eventually, in course of time, put a lot of power into the hands of women. Suffrage movement is the one that is probably most familiar to students, and I will begin with this one precisely because it is the most familiar one, although it is not the earliest one chronologically. Now, it's interesting to mention the United States was not the first country to guarantee all women the right to vote. That was New Zealand in 1893. The suffrage movement in America began a long time ago, in the 1840s. But it was not until 1869 that the first territory, Wyoming, gave women the right to vote. This was very closely followed by Utah in 1870. Now, why would Western territories and also Western states be the first ones to give women the right to vote? Why not so-called enlightened East Coast states like New York or New Jersey and Massachusetts? Why Western states and territories? Well, the answer was that as the Civil War ended, a lot of people were moving somewhere else. They're moving west to get cheap land, to get away from bad memories, etc., etc. And people who were moving west were disproportionately young men, mostly unmarried. Why them? Because they were the ones who could pick up and uproot the easiest and move out because they didn't have a lot of roots to begin with. So as poor young men were moving west, those who were already settled in western states and territories became uneasy. They were thinking, we now have all these paupers coming into our territories. That's not good. How can we counterbalance this? How about we give our women the right to vote? Because the expectation was that women would vote the same way that men voted. So class interests overrode gender interests. By the time the 19th Amendment was ratified, many women already could vote. The 19th Amendment was passed by Congress on the 4th of June of 1919 and ratified by the states on the 18th of August of 1920. The situation by August of 1920 was such that some states already allowed women to vote in all elections. Other states only allowed them to vote in state elections. Yet other states only allowed them to vote in federal elections. And yet other states allowed them to vote not at all. So you had a mess. You had a patchwork of voting rights laws. And this patchwork only underscored the idea that women were not treated as first-class citizens. So the 19th Amendment basically put an end to all this, and it stated that the right of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of sex. The suffrage movement was not the only movement in which women were involved. The abolitionist movement was also such a movement. Many women felt affinity with the slaves because they felt that even though they came from privileged families, these women could not necessarily do what they wanted. They could not leave their fathers or leave their husbands just because they wanted. They could not be economically independent. They felt the dependency and they felt lack of freedom. So for this reason, a lot of women were actually participating in the abolitionist movement. Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Lucretia Mott, two activists in the movement to abolish slavery, called together, in fact, the first conference to address women's rights and issues in Seneca Falls, New York in 1848. And doing so had been in part because Lucretia Mott had been refused permission to speak at the World Anti-Slavery Convention in London, even though she had been an official delegate. So you can see how the two movements, the abolitionist movement that sought to abolish slavery in the United States, intersected with the suffrage movement and the women's right movement, broadly speaking. The Declaration of Sentiments that was adapted in Seneca Falls, New York, was modeled on Thomas Jefferson's Declaration of Independence, and it states that all men and women are created equal. The temperance movement was yet another movement in which women were very active. The temperance movement was dedicated to moderation and sometimes to complete abstinence from alcohol. Now, the earliest organizations in the United States were formed in New York State in 1808 and in Massachusetts in 1813. Because churches were very active in the social movement and America was a very religious nation in the 19th century, by 1833 there were already 3,000 local societies in the United States. Now, some activists, including some women like Carrie Nation, who believed that her destiny was to carry a nation, worked outside the formal confines of the movement, and yet they still worked effectively in this movement. The movement had international scope, and it was characterized by the organized cooperation of women. Now, why would women show so much interest in this? Because they believed they were the primary victims of alcohol abuse, they and, of course, their children. Who is more likely to be an alcoholic? Now, in the 19th century, just as today, there are more male alcoholics than women. And when men drink, who do they often take their anger on? Why? They take anger on their wives, right? Their wives, their children. They can be subject to physical and emotional abuse as a result of men becoming alcoholics. So this played a significant role in the desire of women to limit or even abolish completely the consumption of alcohol. It also should be noted that in the United States, this movement was more than occasionally covered by the anti-Catholic sentiment. As Catholic immigration in the United States exploded in the second half of the 19th century, beginning with the Irish immigration around 1849, 1850, and on into the Italian immigration of the 1880s and 1890s, and the Polish immigration of roughly the same period, a lot of Protestants felt uneasy because they felt that the United States was and should remain a predominantly Protestant country. And they saw that many people had consumption of alcohol as a part of their culture, for example, in Italy, for example, in Ireland. And so to hit them at alcohol was to hit their culture, was to try to stick it to them so they would not feel so joyful coming to the United States. Political power is an important component of the broader idea of women's rights, and political power transcends the mere ability to vote. So suffrage movement is good because it gives you the right to vote, but the right to vote has its limitations. Because if you can vote, but you cannot do anything else politically, if you cannot run for office, then your power to vote is rather limited in effect. So, as you might know, the United States is kind of late by historic terms for women leaders. In Great Britain, Margaret Thatcher was prime minister in the 1980s. In Israel, Golda Meir. In India, Indira Gandhi. In Pakistan, Benazir Bhutto. In Turkey, Tansu Çiller. In Germany, Angela Merkel. In Argentina, Cristina Kirchner. In Brazil, Dilma Rousseff. In Canada, Kim Campbell. So even Canada beat us. Australia had a woman prime minister. So a lot of countries actually were ahead of the United States in this regard. And it's interesting that when Hillary Clinton ran for the Democratic Party's nomination in 2008, she was confronted by two male hecklers, at least one of whom was shouting, "Iron my shirt." And a video of him shouting can be found on YouTube. I have a link in this video. And Clinton responded calmly by saying, the remnants of sexism are alive and well. Now, political power is good, but it may not be enough. Because let's say you can vote and you can run for office and you become the leader of your country, but what about the rest of the women? What about them? They can vote, and what else? How many women, how many people can become leaders of their country? Well, not many. We only have one at a time. So what about the rest? You have to be able to have jobs that give you good income, that give you some social prestige. So if you talk about power, for it to be meaningful to ordinary people, you have to also talk about economic and social power. One way to see how women sort of struggled for their economic and social power and were denied it in the past would be the case of Bradwell versus Illinois. Myra Bradwell asserted her right to a license to practice law in Illinois because she was a United States citizen and she studied with a lawyer and she passed the exam, the bar exam, and so she applied for a license, but she was denied it because the state said we only give a license to men and you're not a man, so we can't give you a license. So she sued, and the argument was that under the 14th Amendment, a clause about privileges and immunities of citizens of the United States She should be given the right to practice law. It's one of the privileges and immunities under the Privileges and Immunities Clause of the 14th Amendment. But the Supreme Court said, no, we do not accept that. And the court agreed that all citizens enjoy certain privileges and immunities. Like what? Well, like the right to travel between states, like the right to travel navigable waters between states. But certainly, privileges and immunities was interpreted very narrowly by the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court said this clause does not include the right to practice a lawful profession. So if your state denies you the right to practice a certain profession, what then? Well, the court's answer here in this case was basically, it's too bad. Even if it's just on the basis of gender, the state decided it, so be it. There's nothing in the Constitution, said the Supreme Court, that says otherwise. But even this was not enough for Justice Bradley, who wrote a concurring opinion, and he went to state that the reason why this decision is a good decision, it's because it's natural and proper for women to be excluded from the legal profession. He cited the importance of maintaining the respective spheres of man and woman, with women performing the duties of motherhood and wife in accordance with the law of the Creator. He also went on to say that the strife of the bar destroys femininity. In other words, you can be either a good lawyer or a good woman, but you can't be both, according to Justice Bradley. Now, of course, all that would change by the second half of the 20th century. As time went by, more and more women entered the workforce and then also entered colleges and universities. And in fact, today, if we're talking about the 21st century, women are more likely to attend college than men. Approximately 55 to 58% of college freshmen are women. So if anything, there's a somewhat noticeable gender gap now in college attendance between men and women, and that gap is in favor of women. So things have definitely changed.